The policeman insists that the disabled man leave the car, ignoring his explanations. The consequences of his actions will prove unpredictable. Samuel's alarm clock beeped softly, pulling him out of the remnants of a dream he couldn't quite recall. His fingers brushed the smooth surface of his phone, silencing the noise with practiced ease. He lay still for a moment, letting the morning quiet settle around him. The room was small but comfortable, its muted light filtering through the blinds and creating long shadows on the worn wooden floor. It wasn't fancy, but it was his, a space that had become both his haven and his anchor. Turning onto his side, Samuel reached for the prosthetic leg resting against the wall beside his bed. He methodically attached it to his body, each movement precise and practiced after years of routine. The soft click of the metal joints as he secured the prosthesis was oddly reassuring, a sound that symbolized resilience more than anything else. Once, he had resented the process, but now it was just another part of his life, a necessity he'd embraced. He stood and stretched, glancing at his reflection in the mirror. It stared back at him, a reminder of the journey he had endured. Nearly 6 years had passed since the accident. He could still recall the chaos, the sound of crunching metal, the acrid smell of burnt rubber, and then the deafening silence. He had survived that day, although not unscathed. Both legs had been lost, his world turned upside down in an instant. But Samuel had clawed his way back, determined not just to survive, but to live. He dressed in his usual practical attire, a pair of dark jeans and a light sweater, before making his way to the kitchen for breakfast. Toast and black coffee had become his staple, a no-fuss meal that fit his uncomplicated mornings. Today was an important day, and his mind buzzed with anticipation as he thought of the plans ahead. A meet-up with friends at a coffee shop downtown. It wasn't extraordinary, but it was meaningful. A chance to connect with the people who had stood by him when everything else seemed to crumble. After breakfast, he grabbed his keys and slung his bag over his shoulder, ensuring his phone was tucked safely inside. His car, parked just outside his modest apartment, was a modified vehicle equipped with hand controls. The adjustments had given him back his independence, a gift he hadn't taken lightly. Driving again had been both terrifying and liberating at first, but now it was second nature. The streets were still quiet as Samuel navigated the familiar roads toward the cafe. Morning light bathed the city in a soft glow, the kind that made even the most mundane sights seem beautiful. He relished these solitary moments, the hum of the engine, the rhythmic motion of his hands on the wheel. It was a time to let his mind wander, to reflect on how far he'd come and what lay ahead. When he pulled into the cafe's parking lot, a sense of anticipation filled him. It was one of his favorite spots, a warm and welcoming place, with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods wafting through the air. He parked and carefully exited the vehicle, adjusting his prosthetics as he prepared to wheel himself inside. His friends were already there, waving from their usual corner table by the window. He smiled, their presence filling him with a quiet sense of comfort. The hours passed quickly as they laughed, shared stories, and simply enjoyed each other's company. It was a reprieve, a reminder that life still held joy despite the struggles. But as Samuel made his way back to his car later that afternoon, something felt off. A police cruiser pulled up behind him, its red and blue lights flashing in his rearview mirror. His heart skipped a beat, his palms suddenly damp against the steering wheel. Had he done something wrong? He replayed his actions in his mind. No speeding, no traffic violations. Yet, the unease lingered. He pulled over to the side of the road, turning off the engine as the officer approached. The man's demeanor was brisk and detached, his voice gruff as he spoke. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer said, leaning down to peer through the open window. Samuel hesitated, his throat tightening. "Officer, I can't. I'm disabled. I use prosthetic legs, and stepping out isn't something I can do easily." The officer's expression didn't change. "I said step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his tone sharper this time. Samuel's chest tightened with a mix of disbelief and frustration. He explained again, his voice calm but firm. "I can show you my ID, my registration, anything you need, but I physically cannot step out." The officer's eyes narrowed, his hand hovering near his belt. "You're not above the law," he snapped. "Now, get out of the car, or I'll assist you." A chill ran through Samuel as the weight of the words sank in. This wasn't about a misunderstanding anymore. The officer's stance was rigid, his hand inching closer to his holster. Fear coiled in Samuel's stomach, but he forced himself to speak. "Please, listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I'm not resisting. I just can't comply with what you're asking." But the officer wasn't listening. His hand gripped the door handle, yanking it open with a force that made Samuel flinch. Before he could react, the officer reached for his arm, pulling him roughly out of the car. Pain shot through Samuel's shoulder as the officer's grip tightened, his prosthetic legs twisting awkwardly in the process. One of them dislodged completely, clattering onto the pavement with a hollow sound. The world around him seemed to slow as a small crowd began to gather. Some bystanders watched in stunned silence, while others pulled out their phones to record the unfolding scene. Samuel's voice rose, his words desperate now. "Stop! You're hurting me. I can't walk. Please, just let me explain." "Shut up," the officer barked, his face a mask of indifference. "You think you can just do whatever you want because of your disability? Not today." Samuel's chest tightened with humiliation and rage. The officer's words cut deeper than he could have imagined. He felt the cold pavement against his back as the officer continued to drag him away from the car. Voices from the crowd grew louder, some shouting in protest, others calling for help. But the officer seemed oblivious, his focus solely on exerting his authority. Then, another police cruiser arrived. A younger officer stepped out, his expression a mix of confusion and concern as he approached. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The older officer barely spared him a glance. "The suspect's resisting," he said curtly. "I'm handling it." The younger officer's gaze shifted to Samuel, taking in the scene, the prosthetic leg lying on the ground, the anguish etched across his face. "He doesn't look like he's resisting to me," the younger officer said, his tone measured but pointed. "Step back. Let's de-escalate this." The older officer bristled, his jaw tightening. "I've got this under control," he snapped. "Don't interfere." "You're not in control," the younger officer shot back. "You're out of line." For a moment, the tension between the two officers was palpable. The older one's face flushed with anger, but the younger officer didn't waver. He knelt beside Samuel, his voice softer now. "Are you okay?" Samuel nodded faintly, though his body ached from the rough handling. "I just want to go home," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The younger officer turned back to his colleague, his expression resolute. "You need to stop," he said firmly. "This isn't how we do things." The older officer's eyes narrowed, his face darkening with frustration. But after a tense pause, he stepped back, muttering under his breath as he walked away. The crowd murmured in relief, some cheering as the younger officer helped Samuel back into his car, carefully adjusting his prosthetic leg. "Thank you," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought no one would step in." The younger officer gave him a small, reassuring smile. "You didn't deserve any of that," he said, "and I'll make sure it's reported." As Samuel drove away, the weight of the incident settled over him. He knew this wasn't over, not for him, and not for the officer who had treated him so callously. But in the midst of the pain and humiliation, there was a glimmer of hope. Someone had stood up for him, and that meant something. In the days that followed, the footage from the bystanders went viral. The images of Samuel being dragged from his car sparked outrage, igniting a conversation about systemic prejudice and abuse of power. Samuel found himself at the center of a growing movement, his story a catalyst for change. It wasn't the path he would have chosen, but it was one he was willing to walk, for himself, for others like him, and for a world that still so much to learn about dignity and respect.